January 1943. Inside a dim room in Tokyo, cigarette smoke hangs over a table covered in photographs. A Japanese intelligence officer adjusts his glasses and leans closer. The black and white images show airfields somewhere in California. Rows of gleaming bombers stretch beyond the camera's reach. Shadows of wings overlap like waves. He flips through more photos. Another base. Another 100 planes. The markings are new. None of these aircraft existed 3 months ago. The officer frowns. He checks the production numbers again. They seem impossible. Outside, snow drifts against the Imperial Army building. Inside, the silence deepens. Someone mutters, 50,000 aircraft? In 1 year? No one answers. Across the ocean, America is awake. Factories roar through the night. Sparks shower from welders. Women in bandanas drive rivets into metal skin. Conveyor belts move like arteries of war. The hum of engines drowns out fatigue, doubt, and fear. What began as a nation caught off guard at Pearl Harbor has become a machine of unstoppable rhythm. America isn't just building planes, it's building momentum. The question now, how did they do it? December 7, 1941. The United States wakes to the sound of war. The attack on Pearl Harbor cripples battleships, destroys aircraft, and shatters the illusion of distance from the conflict. Within hours, President Franklin D. Roosevelt calls it a date which will live in infamy. The next morning, America declares war on Japan. But beneath the anger lies something else. Determination. Factories that once built cars, refrigerators, and farm tools now prepare for something far greater. The U.S. has no choice but to turn its industrial muscle into a weapon. Roosevelt knows that tanks and ships alone won't win the war. The skies will decide the future. In early 1942, he issues a challenge that stuns even his advisors. We shall produce 50,000 planes this year. No one knows if it's possible, but the nation moves as one to make it real. Henry Ford's engineers begin studying how to mass-produce bombers like they once built cars. General Motors converts its assembly lines for engines and fighter fuselages. Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas expand across the country, building new plants almost overnight. The War Production Board, led by industrialist Donald Nelson, reorganizes the entire economy. Civilian car production stops completely. Rubber, aluminum, and copper are rationed. Men leave for the front. Women take their places in factories. Every tool, every screw, every shift counts. In Detroit, the clanging of machines never stops. In Seattle, the night sky glows orange from welding sparks at Boeing Field. In Kansas, B-25 bombers roll out by the dozens each week. The air smells of oil and iron. The rhythm of the war industry becomes the new heartbeat of America. By the summer of 1942, the numbers start to climb. 1,000 planes a month, then 2,000. Engineers streamline assembly, removing every wasted motion. Workers learn to build wings and fuselages faster than anyone thought possible. Each new design arrives more efficient, more modular, easier to replicate. The transformation isn't just mechanical, it's psychological. The nation that had been caught unprepared now feels united by purpose. Posters read, "Victory is our job." Children collect scrap metal from alleys. Housewives volunteer at Red Cross stations. Teenagers join the Civil Air Patrol. Every hour saved in a factory translates to fewer casualties overseas. Every rivet driven becomes a silent act of revenge for Pearl Harbor. By the end of 1942, Roosevelt's wild target begins to look achievable. The United States produces 47,800 aircraft. Japan manages just over $8,000, and yet, Japan's high command still refuses to believe it. Intelligence officers dismiss the reports as propaganda. They cannot imagine that a single nation could produce more aircraft in 12 months than their empire could in 3 years. But the truth is spreading. From factory floors to Pacific battlefields, American squadrons arrive faster than Japan can replace its losses. The balance of the war begins to tilt. In the silence of Tokyo's intelligence offices, new reports land on desks, each one more alarming than the last. The enemy isn't just winning battles, it's mastering production. Before Pearl Harbor, Japan's leadership viewed American industry with cautious respect, not fear. Their intelligence assessments from the 1930s painted the U.S. as wealthy but sluggish. They believed America's democracy would paralyze quick mobilization. That faith in bureaucracy would stall war production. They were wrong. The Japanese war machine had been built for speed and conquest, not endurance. Its aircraft factories, though efficient, were small and scattered. The Mitsubishi and Nakajima plants produced superb fighters like the A6M-0, but output depended on scarce raw materials. Every engine built required imported aluminum, oil, and rubber. Japan's islands simply lacked resources. Its empire stretched far, yet its shipping convoys were vulnerable. Each American submarine that struck a cargo ship meant fewer engines, fewer planes. Industrial Japan was a candle burning at both ends. Across the Pacific, the United States was turning into something else entirely. A fortress of production. Within months, Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy became a global phenomenon. Journalists visited plants in California, Michigan, and Ohio, describing them as cities within cities. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, construction crews worked around the clock to build what would become the largest factory under one roof in the world. It was designed specifically for the B-24 Liberator bomber. Conveyor belts stretched a mile long. Raw aluminum entered at one end. Fully armed bombers rolled out the other. By mid-1943, Willow Run was producing one B-24 every 63 minutes. The concept of mass production, once reserved for automobiles, now applied to machines of war. This system stunned observers worldwide. Even the British, veterans of industrial warfare, admitted that America had reached a scale unseen in history. The Soviet Union called it mechanized miracle. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to replace each aircraft lost in battle. The Mitsubishi A6M, once dominant over the Pacific, began to fall behind. U.S. designs like the F-6F Hellcat, P-38 Lightning, and P-51 Mustang now filled the skies. American pilots flew with the confidence of numbers. They knew replacements would always come. To Tokyo's intelligence networks, this surge looked impossible. In 1942, their analysts reported that American aircraft output had surpassed 45,000 units. Senior officers dismissed the figures as statistical deception. They couldn't, except that factories once building cars and washing machines could now flood the Pacific with bombers and fighters. But the evidence mounted. From Guadalcanal to New Guinea, Japanese pilots encountered fresh squadrons every month. Each time they believed the Americans must be running out of aircraft, yet the next battle proved otherwise. By 1943, even the Imperial General Staff began to understand. The war's true front wasn't in the jungles or skies. It was in Detroit, Seattle, and Buffalo. The decisive weapon wasn't a new bomber or tank. It was America's ability to make more of them, faster than anyone could destroy them. As the months passed, Tokyo's optimism turned to dread. Every captured American pilot spoke of endless reinforcements. Every intercepted radio message hinted at new factories, new assembly lines, new squadrons, the empire that began. The war with confidence now faced an opponent whose strength seemed bottomless. 3. Question echoing through Japan's command halls was no longer how to win, but how to keep up. The technological angle, assembly line warfare. What made the American miracle possible wasn't just manpower. It was engineering discipline. Before 1941, aircraft construction was a slow craft. Every plane was hand-fitted, every rivet adjusted by eye. Factories worked like workshops, not machines. When the war began, that model had to die. Henry Ford's engineers brought the automotive mindset into aviation. They broke down complex aircraft into modular parts. Wings, engines, fuselages, all separated into units that could be mass-produced by unskilled labor and snapped together later. Willow Run was the crown jewel of this shift. Its layout followed the logic of car factories: continuous flow, minimal movement, total precision. Workers no longer needed years of training. They learned one motion, perfected it, and repeated it thousands of times. Standardization became sacred. Every nut, every bolt, every wire length followed uniform blueprints. Subcontractors across the country produced interchangeable parts. If one factory was bombed or delayed, another could fill the gap instantly. The outcome was staggering. In 1940, building a bomber took months. By 1943, it took hours. What had once been custom craftsmanship became industrial rhythm. America didn't just build airplanes. It built a system that built airplanes. The Japanese watched this evolution with disbelief. Their factories still relied on expert craftsmen and hand-tuned parts. Each plane that left a Mitsubishi line carried a fingerprint of human touch. Beautiful, but slow. Against a foe that could produce one plane every hour, tradition became a weakness. To die Feintanz en Habertreu. The human angle. The hands that built victory behind the roaring machines and glowing furnaces were ordinary Americans who had never seen a battlefield. They became the invisible army. When men left for Europe and the Pacific, the factories filled with new faces. Women took the place of husbands, fathers, and brothers. Posters of Rosie the Riveter reminded them that their labor was as vital as any soldier's courage. Factories became cities. In Detroit, entire neighborhoods grew around the plants. Buses ran 24 hours. Cafeterias served meals between night shifts. Inside the hangars, heat from machinery made the air thick with oil and sweat. Yet morale stayed high. Workers competed to beat production records. Each completed bomber carried a name, a signature, sometimes even a message scrawled on the fuselage for the pilots who would fly it. African Americans, long excluded from skilled labor, entered the defense industry through President Roosevelt's Fair Employment Order. Immigrants and farmhands learned to operate drills, presses, and welding torches. Every background, every accent, every hand became part of one purpose: build faster. It wasn't easy. Fatigue was constant. Mistakes meant delays, and delays meant lives lost overseas. Supervisors tracked output hour by hour. If one section slowed, the entire line halted. Pressure built with every passing day. Yet workers understood something profound. Each rivet they drove into metal skin was a weapon against tyranny. Every completed wing or fuselage was a promise to someone fighting far away. Letters from pilots began arriving at factories, short notes of gratitude. "Your plane got me home," one read. Another, from a B-17 crew, thanked the women of Boeing for the bomber that saved them over Bremen. Those messages traveled through bulletin boards, spreading pride and urgency. By 1943, the workforce included more than 2.5 million women in defense production. Many had never worked outside the home. Now they built engines, gun turrets, and control panels. The war turned assembly lines into symbols of unity. People who had never agreed on anything now shared the same goal: outbuild the enemy. At the height of it all, a shift change at Willow Run looked like an army on the march. Thousands of workers streamed in and out, their faces smeared with oil and dust, their clothes smelling of fuel. The sound of footsteps mixed with the thunder of machinery. It was the sound of war, fought not with rifles, but with time, mettle, and resolve. The Japanese High Command could count planes and analyze tonnage, but they could not measure spirit. What they faced wasn't just industrial power. It was a nation that believed production itself was patriotism. 3. The leadership angle. The visionaries behind the machine. The miracle of 50,000 planes didn't happen by chance. It required leaders who could see war not just as combat, but as organization. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this early. He called America the great arsenal of democracy, turning a phrase into a national mission. His confidence radiated downward into every boardroom, assembly line, and design office. But the real architects of output were industrial commanders, men like William Knudsen, former General Motors executive, and Donald Nelson, head of the War Production Board. They faced chaos at first: overlapping contracts, material shortages, untrained workers, and rival corporations competing for government orders. Knudsen imposed order. He divided production into clear goals, assigning entire industries to single purposes. Ford built bombers. Chrysler made tanks. General Electric produced engines and electronics. Boeing and Douglas handled heavy bombers. The nation became one coordinated organism. Roosevelt's cabinet treated these men like generals. They wore suits instead of uniforms, but their battleground was the factory floor. Knudsen toured plants personally, pushing efficiency and morale. He knew the war could not be won by the Army unless America's industry became faster than time itself. Under their leadership, workers felt direction, not chaos. Schedules tightened, innovations multiplied, and new factories rose from open fields in weeks. Roosevelt called them temples of production. It was the first time in history that a democracy had out-organized dictatorships built on discipline. Germany and Japan ran on command. America ran on cooperation. That paradox became its strength. The enemy angle, disbelief and desperation, inside Tokyo's Naval General Staff Building. Reports from the Pacific grew increasingly grim. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were noticing something strange. Every time they shot down an American squadron, another one appeared days later, fresher, better equipped, flying new planes with higher performance. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan's air forces were bleeding pilots faster than they could train replacements. Each Japanese airman lost meant months of irreplaceable skill gone forever. Each American loss meant a new graduate from flight school waiting to take the seat. The numbers told the story no general wanted to admit. By 1944, U.S. aircraft output had passed 96,000 planes. Japan's total stood at barely a tenth of that. Yet, disbelief lingered. Intelligence officers still questioned whether such production could be real. They blamed American propaganda, inflated numbers, or faked photos. Even as captured U.S. bombers filled airfields in Saipan and Guam, the scale of it defied logic. For Japan's leaders, this realization came too late. By the time they understood that America's factories were the real weapon, their own had begun to crumble under bombing raids. The irony was cruel. While Japan struggled to protect its homeland, America was producing aircraft faster than bombs could destroy them. A Japanese officer later recalled, "We had trained for courage, not for competition. We did not know how to fight a nation that could build like this." The logistics angle. Feeding the beast-building planes was only half the battle. Getting parts, materials, and fuel to factories demanded an invisible war of logistics. The U.S. railroad system became the arteries of the arsenal. Trains carried aluminum ingots, engines, and propellers across thousands of miles. Each region specialized in something. The South handled shipbuilding steel. The Midwest built engines. The West Coast finished aircraft. Oil pipelines extended from Texas to the East Coast to supply fuel. New smelters and refineries emerged almost overnight. Even the mail system became a logistical network for blueprints and technical updates between companies. The sheer coordination was unprecedented. By 1943, the United States was managing over 250,000 subcontractors, each feeding a part into the war machine. Where Germany rationed every ton of metal, America flooded the assembly lines. A single B-29 bomber required over 65,000 separate parts. Yet somehow, every screw arrived on time. This precision gave America momentum Japan couldn't match. Their islands, dependent on shipping routes constantly attacked by submarines, began to choke. Factories in Nagoya and Yokohama slowed. Aluminum shipments never arrived. Fuel dwindled. Even when new fighter designs appeared, there weren't enough resources to build them at scale. In the Pacific, American planes now outnumbered Japanese ones in every engagement. The sky that once belonged to the Zero was now filled with Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Liberators. The final outcome was no longer in question. Only time separated Japan from defeat. The machine was in motion. The men and women of America had turned industrial might into military dominance, and soon that power would reveal its full force across the Pacific. By mid-1943, the United States had achieved what no nation in history had done. Factories across the continent produced aircraft at a pace that defied imagination. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan. It was a living organism of noise, smoke, and movement. At Willow Run, assembly lines moved like veins of steel. Conveyor belts carried unfinished bombers past rows of workers who moved in perfect rhythm. Riveters, welders, inspectors. Each motion measured, each second accounted for. Above them, overhead cranes slid wings into place. At the line's end, engines roared for the first time as fresh bombers taxied out under their own power. One every hour, day and night. In California, Douglas aircraft turned the city of Long Beach into a production maze. Boeing's Seattle plant built thousands of B-17 flying fortresses that soon filled the skies over Europe. Lockheed's lines produced the P-38 Lightning, its twin booms slicing through the air with speed the Japanese could barely counter. The Pacific War Front began to feel the impact. In early 1943, American squadrons that once fought, outnumbered, now attacked with numerical superiority. At Guadalcanal, waves of U.S. bombers and fighters overwhelmed Japanese airfields. By late 1943, U.S. naval task forces advanced across the Solomons under a protective ceiling of American aircraft. Japanese pilots still fought with ferocity, but the balance was gone. The Zero, once a symbol of aerial dominance, now faced faster, tougher opponents. The F-6F Hellcat, rolling out of Grumman's factories by the hundreds each month, proved unstoppable. The difference wasn't just the plane, it was the supply chain behind it. A damaged U.S. aircraft could be repaired with parts from anywhere in the country. A damaged Japanese plane often stayed grounded for weeks, waiting for components that might never come. In the air, numbers began to tell the story. In 1942, Japan could still put up strong defenses. By 1943, American planes outnumbered Japanese fighters 3-1. By 1944, the ratio reached 10-1. The transformation was visible from the sky. Allied reconnaissance photographs captured sprawling aircraft fields across the American mainland. Wings glinting in the sunlight, stretching to the horizon. Each airfield looked like an industrial city, each filled with hundreds of planes awaiting deployment. Japan's intelligence officers studied those images in disbelief. They couldn't understand how an open, democratic society with no central warlord, no imperial cult, could move so fast. The secret lay in America's unity of purpose. Every worker believed they were part of something larger. Every engineer understood that design speed mattered more than perfection. Every leader trusted that innovation would solve problems faster than planning could predict them. When Roosevelt reviewed the latest production reports in late 1943, his aides were stunned. The goal of 50,000 planes had been not only met, but exceeded. Aircraft plants had produced over 85,000 units that year. Each new bomber leaving a hangar was more than a weapon. It was a message to every soldier, sailor, and pilot fighting overseas. The homeland would not fail them. By the end of 1943, the United States had built an air force so vast that logistics officers struggled to find pilots fast enough to fly the planes. Training programs expanded. Airfields multiplied. The U.S. Army Air Forces became the largest in history. The sound of piston engines and propellers filled every American horizon. What began as desperation after Pearl Harbor had become unstoppable momentum. Japan's skies would soon feel the weight of that momentum. The tide of war was about to turn, not through a single battle, but through the sheer pressure of production. In 1944, that pressure broke the Pacific wide open. From island to island, America's industrial power began to show its full reach. Bombers that had once taken months to appear now filled the runways of bases from Guadalcanal to the Marianas. The U.S. Navy, backed by constant air cover, moved freely across the ocean that once belonged to Japan. The real turning point came with the Mariana Islands campaign. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were more than strategic targets. They were the key to bringing Japan within range of American heavy bombers. By mid-1944, the sky over the Pacific became a constant storm of engines. U.S. carriers launched hundreds of aircraft at a time. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, a seamless wall of American steel and coordination. Japan's Air Command scrambled to resist. They deployed every available Zero, every reserve pilot. Yet for every Japanese plane destroyed, 5 new American aircraft replaced it within weeks. The imbalance reached its breaking point during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history. American radar systems, experienced pilots, and overwhelming numbers turned the engagement into a slaughter. When Japanese aircraft finally reached the American fleet, they were met by waves of Hellcats. In hours, hundreds of Japanese planes were gone. U.S. sailors called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't arrogance. It was math. Japan lost over 600 aircraft in 2 days. Many of their best pilots went down with them. America lost fewer than 130. Within weeks, new aircraft from the mainland replaced every loss. For Japan, each aircraft destroyed meant a hole in their air defense that could not be filled. This moment marked the death of Japanese air power. From then on, Japan's skies belonged to the United States. Factories back home continued their relentless pace. By late 1944, American aircraft production had exceeded 96,000 planes in a single year. New models like the B-29 Superfortress rolled out, designed specifically to reach Japan from the Marianas. While U.S. bombers began nightly raids over Tokyo, Japan's production collapsed under fire. Bombing raids burned entire districts. Aluminum factories were destroyed. Engine plants went silent. The empire that had once struck fear across Asia now struggled to produce a few hundred fighters a month. The irony was brutal. The very weapon Japan had unleashed at Pearl Harbor, the airplane, now became the tool of its own destruction. On the ground, Japanese soldiers fought on with courage and discipline, but they were fighting a machine that never stopped. Every destroyed tank, every downed aircraft, every sunken ship was replaced within weeks by new ones. American generals understood the psychological shift. The war was no longer about tactics or even technology. It was about endurance, and endurance had become America's strongest weapon. When U.S. airmen flew the first B-29 raids over Tokyo in late 1944, They flew with the confidence that thousands more bombers were already waiting behind them. Factories in Kansas, California, and Michigan worked non-stop to replace anything lost. Japan's leaders received the reports in disbelief. One intelligence memo estimated that enemy aircraft production exceeds the combined capacity of the entire Axis. It wasn't an exaggeration. By the end of 1944, Japan faced the impossible. For every Zero built, America produced 10 Hellcats. For every bomber Japan launched, America sent 100. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a one-sided storm. The Empire's generals began preparing civilians for defense. Underground factories were planned. Kamikaze units were formed. It was desperation, not strategy. They knew industrially the war was already over, because in every sense that mattered, materials, manpower, machines, Japan had lost the invisible war of production. By the start of 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was inevitable. America's factories had written the ending before the final battles were even fought. The next phase would show what happens when overwhelming production power meets a nation already cornered. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing under the weight of industrial reality. Every battle now carried the same rhythm: overwhelming American air power, shrinking Japanese resistance, and skies filled with bombers that seemed endless. The once proud Japanese Zero, a marvel of design in 1941, had become a relic. It was fast and agile, but it couldn't match the armor or firepower of America's new machines. While Japan produced fewer than 9,000 aircraft in 1944, the United States rolled out more than 10 times that number. Each American aircraft carried more than bombs. It carried proof of industrial superiority. Factories like Willow Run, Douglas Long Beach, and Boeing Seattle had become engines of history. At their peak, over 2.3 million workers were directly involved in aircraft production. Behind them stood millions more: miners, engineers, farmers, machinists, all connected to the same goal: victory through output. When B-29 superfortresses began striking Japan's cities from the Marianas in mid-1944, they represented the ultimate expression of that goal. These bombers flew higher, farther, and faster than anything before them. Built from aluminum mined in Arkansas, engines forged in Detroit, and electronics assembled in New Jersey, each B-29 embodied the scale of America's reach. To Japan, it felt like fighting a nation of factories. Tokyo's streets burned night after night under incendiary raids. Entire districts were erased. Aluminum shortages turned desperate. Fuel became almost mythical. Even training new pilots grew impossible. There were no planes left to train with. The psychological toll was devastating. For every American bomber lost, 10 more arrived. For every city reduced to rubble, new U.S. bases appeared closer to Japan's shores. The empire had gambled on spirit over industry, but spirit couldn't outbuild mass production. Inside American war offices, production graphs told the real story of victory. By the end of 1944, the U.S. had built over 300,000 aircraft since the start of the war. Of those, more than 60,000 bombers and 100,000 fighters had been delivered to combat zones. No other country in history had mobilized like this. Factories no longer needed motivational posters. The numbers spoke for themselves. Workers who had once doubted Roosevelt's 50,000 plane goal now read headlines declaring America had surpassed double that figure. On the front lines, soldiers and sailors noticed the difference. Supply lines never ran dry. Damaged equipment was replaced faster than it could be missed. Air superiority was no longer contested. It was guaranteed. Even Germany, whose Luftwaffe once ruled Europe's skies, felt the industrial shadow of American might. By 1945, Allied bombers, many built in the same plants supplying the Pacific, crushed German industry too. The American home front had turned into something that neither Axis power could comprehend. A single, synchronized engine that ran on unity, speed, and precision. But the cost was enormous. Tens of thousands of workers suffered injuries, fatigue, and stress. The pace demanded sacrifice. Families rarely saw one another. Entire towns revolved around factory schedules. Still, when news of victories reached the factory floors, the exhaustion vanished for a moment. Every report of progress across the Pacific felt personal. Every captured island, every downed enemy aircraft, every bomber that made it home, all of it felt earned. By early 1945, Japan's leaders faced the inevitable. Their cities burned. Their factories were silent. The U.S. had become a force of nature, churning out more aircraft in a week than Japan could in a month. The war's end was approaching, but for Japan, it would not come through surrender alone. It would come through realization that America had redefined warfare itself, not through bravery or luck, through production. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice trembled as he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. But beneath that phrase lay another truth. Japan hadn't just been defeated by atomic power, it had been crushed by production power. In the ruins of Tokyo, captured Japanese officers studied American industrial reports with disbelief. The idea that one nation could manufacture over 50,000 aircraft in a single year seemed unreal. In fact, they discovered the number had nearly doubled by 1944. Factories that had once made washing machines were now producing fuselages. Car plants made bomber engines. Typewriter companies made machine gun parts. Every American company had found a role in the war. The transformation stunned Japanese analysts. Their own industries were fragmented, often competing rather than coordinating. Resources were scarce, and the military clung to outdated production methods. In contrast, the U.S. had achieved total synchronization. Every bolt, every screw, every piece of steel had a purpose. The result was not only quantity, but also quality. American aircraft grew faster, stronger, and more adaptable as the war progressed. Designs like the P-51 Mustang and F-6F Hellcat turned air combat into a science. Pilots who once faced superior Japanese fighters now dominated the skies with advanced engineering and overwhelming numbers. And behind every plane stood a name. A worker from Michigan, a welder from Kansas, a riveter from California. The faces of ordinary Americans, each contributing to a machine that reshaped the world. For Japan, the numbers told a brutal truth. By 1945, the United States had produced over 324,000 aircraft, while Japan had barely reached 76,000. And nearly half of those Japanese planes never reached battle due to shortages, sabotage, or lack of trained pilots. The American system was unstoppable because it was decentralized. Even if one factory was destroyed, dozens more took its place. The war had revealed a new kind of power. Industrial resilience. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the bombing campaign against Japan, later said, "Our factories at home won this war before we ever dropped a bomb." His words echoed across post-war years, shaping U.S. strategy for decades to come. When peace finally returned, many of those vast production lines shut down, but their influence never disappeared. The engineers who had designed bombers went on to create jetliners. The women who had built fighters became icons of modern labor. The logistical systems that moved millions of tons of material became the foundation of post-war global trade. The war had ended, but the machine that built victory had only just begun. In Tokyo Bay, as the USS Missouri hosted Japan's formal surrender, U.S. aircraft filled the skies overhead, waves of silver bombers glinting in the sun. It was a display not of arrogance but of capacity, proof that America had mastered the modern war's true weapon: production. To Japanese soldiers watching from shattered docks, the sight was humbling. Each plane was a message written in steel and fuel. This is what happens when a nation unites its industry with purpose. In the ashes of defeat, Japan would remember that lesson well. Within 2 decades, it would rebuild its own industrial might, learning from the very system that once overwhelmed it. The world had entered a new era, one where battles were won not only by courage, but by who could build faster, stronger, and longer. The assembly line had become the front line. In the end, the story of America's 50,000 planes was more than a statistic. It was a revelation of what modern war demanded. Victory no longer belonged to the nation with the most soldiers or the fiercest spirit. It belonged to the nation that could build, repair, and replace faster than anyone else. Factories had become the true battlefields. Engineers were as vital as generals. Welders, mechanics, and machinists shaped outcomes more than strategy ever could. The Japanese soldiers who once believed discipline and sacrifice alone could win a war faced a new truth. Industrial speed had become destiny. That year, when the United States built 50,000 planes, changed not just the war, but the world's understanding of power. It proved that in the age of machines, the side that mastered production mastered victory itself. After 1945, every major military force would study what America had achieved. Not just how it fought, but how it built. The lesson became the foundation of Cold War strategy, global logistics, and modern defense industries. Behind every blueprint and bomber stood one defining principle: the union of human will and industrial precision. In that sense, the American home front was not separate from the battlefield. It was the battlefield. Men and women who never held a rifle still fought the war. Through hours, labor, and sweat. Their legacy outlived the machines they built. The 50,000 planes were not symbols of destruction, but of transformation. They showed what happens when a nation turns unity into motion. That motion carried America through the war, across the century, and into history. As the country that proved the greatest weapon of World War II wasn't a bomb, a plane, or a tank. It was production itself.